14.1, number 1, solve the following quadratic equation using the definition of a square root. And we're going to use the square root method, which the first thing you want to do is get the squared thing. I'll say this sort of non-technically. Get the squared thing, or I'll say term or parentheses, by itself. And when I say get the squared term by itself, really what I mean is the variable. So the x squared, that's the part that we want to get by itself. And the parentheses, in some cases, we'll see some examples later on where we have a parentheses that's squared. And if we're using the square root method, we want to get that parentheses all by itself or get that variable all by itself. So here we start with 3x squared equals 81. And in order to get the x squared by itself, we're going to start off by dividing 3. So then I'll go ahead and take care of that first step. And we'll be left with x squared equals 81. And then the second thing you'll do, once you've got the squared variable or parentheses by itself, then you want to square root both sides. And I always put this plus minus here because when you square root both sides, you'll basically make two answers, one positive, one negative, but you won't remember that if you don't put the plus minus there. So square root the left, square root the right. What the square root does is it cancels out the square. So we're square rooting a square. It's basically like adding 2 and then subtracting 2. So all we're left with is x equals plus or minus the square root of 81, which comes out nicely to just 9. Be careful here, and on all these other examples, anytime you square root both sides, you're going to put a plus or minus after that step. Number 2, 49y squared equals 4, so square root method. We're going to get the squared, I'll say variable this time, variable or parentheses by itself. So in this case, we've only got a variable that's squared. So what we would start by doing is getting rid of that 49 by dividing it. Then we end up with y squared equals 4 over 49. Don't turn that into a decimal, just leave it as a fraction. Then our second step is to square root both sides. And don't forget your plus minus. So square root the left, square root the right. Remember the 2 on the y and the square root both cancel each other out, and we're left with y equals plus or minus. I'll go ahead and write this out. Square root of 4 over 49, which we can simplify a bit because the square root of 4 on top is 2. The square root of 49 on bottom is 7. And by the way, if the computer wants you to put in 2 different answers, all this is saying here is that you've got a positive version of the answer. You've also got a negative version of the answer. So 2 over 7 would be one answer, and then negative 2 over 7 would be the other. Number 3, x squared minus 45 equals 0. So here we want to get the squared variable or parentheses by itself. And unlike the other ones where we had a number butted up against the squared variable, here we're subtracting 45. So if we want to get that x squared by itself, we just have to add 45. X squared equals 45, and then once you've got the squared variable by itself, you're going to square root both sides. So we've got x equals, after you've done that, make sure you plus minus. So we're going to have two possible answers. And then the square root of 45, if this was the square root of 25, we could just put 5 on the next step. If it was the square root of 100, we could just put 10 on the next step. But the square root of 45 doesn't come out quite so neatly. So what I'm going to do instead is look for some squares that might be in it. So squares are just things that can be made by squaring something. So 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared. Really, you just have to go up to about half of the number. So half of 45 would be about 22.5. So really, we just need to look at the 16, the 9, and the 4. And it turns out 9 is a factor of 45. So what we'll do is we'll write this as the square root of 9 times 5. 9 times 5 is 45. And then keep in mind that the square root of 9, we do know what that is. So going into the next step, we've got x equals plus or minus. The square root of 9 part is 3. Square root of 5 we don't know, so we just leave it like that. Number 4, 4 times the quantity y minus 2 squared equals 180. So using the square root method again, just like we did on the first 3 examples, we want to get the squared variable or the squared parentheses by itself. And here we've got a squared parentheses that we want to get all by itself. So the only thing with it on its side of the equals is that 4. So since the 4 is being multiplied, I'm going to go ahead and divide 4 on both sides. That'll cancel out the 4's on the left. And we'll be left with y minus 2 squared equals 180 over 4, which is 45. Next, you'll square root both sides, because what we want to do on the second step is get rid of that squared. So square rooting gets rid of the 2 in the square root. Then we're left with just the y minus 2 equals plus or minus. And the square root of 5 we did just a minute ago, I'll go through that process again. It's not a square like 25 is or like 36 is. But if you go through your list, 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared. 9 is a factor of 45, so we can rewrite that as square root of 9 times 5. Square root of 9 is 3, so we've got y minus 2. I'm going to ignore the left just for a minute. Square root of 3, square root of 5. And then our last step here, unlike the other ones, is to get that y all by itself. So what we've got to do there is just to add 2. And you'll want to put that 2 here in front of the plus minus. So on the left, we're just left with y, and on the right we've got 2, then plus or minus 3 square root of 5. Be careful you don't put the 2 and the 3 together and make 5 square root of 5, because really what we've got is 2 and 3 square root of 5, which are not like terms. We cannot combine them into one thing. If you do need to put this in as 2 different answers, every once in a while they'll give you 2 boxes where you can't put in the plus minus. You would just put in 2 plus 3 square root of 5 as one answer, and then 2 minus 3 square root of 5 as the other. Number 5, we've got 2y plus 14 squared equals 32. First step is to get the squared variable. We don't have a squared variable here. Or the squared parentheses. We do have a squared parentheses. We want to get it all by itself. So the squared parentheses we want to get all by itself. It is already by itself. There's no 4 out front. There's no minus 45 on the end. So that first step that we've been doing, we don't need to do here. Next, what you want to do is square root both sides. So step 1 we took care of, and then step 2, square root the left and the right. That gets rid of the square there. And we're left with 2y plus 14 equals, be careful you don't forget the plus or minus. And then, again, the square root of 32, that's not a nice one like square root of 25. So we're going to look for squares in it. Same list, 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared. And 25 doesn't go in, but 16 is a factor. So you can rewrite 32 as 16 times 2. So going on to the next step, 2y plus 14 equals plus or minus. Square root of 16, hopefully we know, is 4. And then the square root of 2 stays on the inside there. So 4 square root of 2. Then we're just going to start moving everything away from the y. We need to get rid of the 2. We need to get rid of the 14. We'll start by subtracting the 14. Make sure you put that in front of the plus minus. So we've got 2y on the left equals negative 14 plus or minus 4 square root of 2. And then the last step, we want to get that y by itself. Divide 2. Y equals, I'm going to go ahead and divide both of these by 2. So negative 14 over 2 is negative 7. Plus or minus 4 over 2, which is 2, square root of 2. Number 6, x minus 8 squared equals negative 169. I've put a little star over here next to this one. It's just a slight bit different than some of the others. But just like that first step on the first 5 examples, it's the same here. We want to get the squared variable by itself, no squared variable here, or the squared parentheses. We do have a squared parentheses on the left. It is already by itself, so that number 1, that first step is already done. Second step, we want to square root the left and the right. So go ahead and do that. The 2 and the square root are gone. Left with x minus 8 on the left equals plus or minus. Be careful you don't forget that. And then on the right side, 169 is one of those nice ones that comes out, you know, like the square root of 25 comes out to 5. Square root of 169 comes out to 13. So this works out nicely. But anytime you've got a square root with a negative on the inside of it, this is non-real. And so we've got to show by taking out an I that this is non-real. So I'll go ahead and do this that one step. And then continue this down below. X minus 8 equals plus or minus. Square root of 169 is 13. So instead of I times square root of 169, I'll just make this 13I. And then get the x by itself. Add 8. Remember to put that in front of the plus minus. So we ultimately get x equals 8 plus or minus 13i. And again, don't put the 8 and 13 together. They're not like terms. One has an I and one doesn't have a variable. Number 7, I put a star next to this one also. A little bit different than some of the others. The last one had I. This one's not going to have I. But we'll go through the steps. First step, get the squared parentheses by itself. Here, the squared parentheses here on the left is all by itself. We don't have any number out front. We don't have a minus 3 on the end or anything like that. Just the parentheses that's squared. So first off, we're going to, since we don't need to get it by itself, we'll just do the square rooting both sides. The 2 is gone, the square root is gone, and we've got x plus 3 equals plus or minus square root of 4 is just 2. Last step, subtract 3, put that in front of the plus minus, and we've got x equals negative 3 plus or minus 2. Okay, normally this would be where you'd stop, but these are like terms. And anytime you have like terms on the same side, you'll want to put them together before you decide on the final answer. And in this case, we're saying negative 3 plus 2, but we're also saying negative 3 minus 2. So I'll go ahead and write that below. Negative 3 plus 2, that'll give us something. Negative 3 minus 2, that'll give us something different. So negative 3 plus 2 is negative 1. That'll be one of your answers that you enter. And then negative 3 minus 2 would give you negative 5.